Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Pensions Update 2022, IORP 2 and the Journey Ahead. I'm delighted to be joined by a familiar face to many, Jerry Moriarty, CEO of the Irish Association of Pension Funds.
Morning, Stephen.
Just to flag, we'll start off, and we have a couple of poll questions that we're going to ask. And we'll give the answers halfway through the seminar. They sort of feed into the topics that we're going to be discussing today. So if people can vote on these polls, it'd be very helpful just to give a bit of colour to the conversation. Just to flag another point as well, Jerry and I will do as best as we can to address as many questions. If you do use the function, just to submit your questions, we'll ask as many, answer as many as we possibly can at the end. And if we don't get to them, please do send either Jerry or myself an email, and we'd be delighted to assist. Well, so here we are. It's the 10th of March. I think 2 years to the day that myself and Jerry had a webinar from Glasnevin, and hopefully this is probably the last webinar we'll have in Glasnevin, and we'll have physical or hybrid events going forward. So I'll just move along into the first slide here. Let's hide the poll, sorry, it's blocking my view. Okay, so as I said, the last webinar that Jerry and myself did was almost 2 years ago to the day, just as we entered into the great unknown of the pandemic. So we're going to have a little look back at the pandemic and pensions, what happened, what effects it had, what lessons can be learned. The main niche, I suppose, of today's webinar will be the EU Occupational Pension Schemes Regs 2021, or as we all know, the IORP 2 regs. So probably two things that people in pensions are absolutely sick of: the pandemic and 2B. But please don't quit, don't shoot the messenger here. Then we're going to look at practice, which gave a bit more kind of background and assistance, hopefully, in the application of the IORP 2 regs. Next, we're going then we'll look at master trusts. But I'm sorry, I'm getting all sorts of windows flashing up here. Hopefully we're still okay. Then I'll look at master trusts, and also we'll go to have a little look at what's coming down the line and the future in terms of pensions coming down the road. Okay, so the pandemic and pensions. What did we learn? As I said, it's almost 2 years to the day that we had the pandemic, and myself and Jerry had to talk about what possibly happened.
Would you mind just resharing your slides, please?
Okay.
Yeah, we just lost you there for a second, so I think the slides disappeared as well.
Okay. Share slides. So start again, essentially. Any luck?
No, not yet. Great.
I've shared them now, Stephen, so you can go ahead.
Okay. Okay, sorry everybody. Gremlins in the system. I will just, sorry Sinead, just working through the slides. I can't move them.
So I'm sharing them, Stephen, so I'll move them along for you.
Okay, great. All right, apologies. So I suppose the first slide should be about webinars and technology and how we all should be delighted to go back to the office, but I'll put that in the next one. Okay, so the first element I suppose I want to look at today is the pandemic and pensions. So what did we learn from the pandemic in terms of pensions, apart from Zoom calls? Tend to be erratic at the best of times, and people with lack of technological knowledge are probably best off giving in-person talks. Okay, so if we look at it, the first thing I had a look at the slides that we produced 2 years ago for the presentation. The first thing that I flagged was business continuity plans and how we needed to assess business continuity plans for pensions. Would they work during the pandemic? And my experience was basically that they did. They all worked effectively. At the start, there was some discussions about schemes, about suspending contributions. And my feeling was some schemes did do it, but not a lot. And even those schemes that did suspend contributions, they didn't really do it for long. So if the suspensions came in March, April 2020, really those schemes lifted those suspensions a couple of months ago, months later. Trustee meetings, this was a big point we flagged, and it had to do really about how they actually would work. So a lot of work that we initially did was in relation to assessing under the scheme's rules, could a meeting happen electronically? By and large, there was no issues whatsoever with pension schemes having electronic meetings. A couple of the older schemes needed some amendment to the trust documentation to facilitate that. One thing we did come across, and we had to work on a few repairs, for want of a better description, are data protection issues in relation to trustee meetings, because people were sharing documentation through really mechanisms that weren't designed for trustee meetings. So sending WhatsApp pictures of scheme documentation, letters, etc. So that was an area that needed a bit of work on. Funding, my experience, and bear in mind I'm not an investment manager, but from a legal perspective, I saw no great rush to fix any funding issues. There was no cliff edge that we saw in 08, 09. No knee-jerk reaction, so I think a lot of lessons were learned from the financial crisis, and these were put into practice in terms of assuring there was no knee-jerk funding movements. One thing I would flag is at the start of the pandemic, I had a look at what they were doing in the UK, and very quickly their version of the PUP had in place a replacement for our pension contributions. So their PUP didn't just include salary, it included an element of pensions. And we wondered whether this would happen in Ireland. Now, the PUP never did extend to pension contributions. So perhaps that shows where pensions really sit in the scheme of things, because I think it should have been seen as an overall remuneration package and thought a bit more in that regard. Debt and service, I had a very scary slide about catastrophe clauses and in relation to schemes and insurers essentially going bust due to an avalanche of claims. Thankfully, that didn't happen, notwithstanding it was a devastating event in terms of illness and death. But there was no great claim rush in terms of debt and service or any issues. So, Jerry, from your perspective, are there any lessons, or is there anything you can take from the pandemic and pensions?
Yeah, I think you've covered off most of them. I think it was amazing how resilient sector was when you consider, you know, the administration of pension schemes effectively moved out of offices into people's homes, and that was done in a very seamless way. I think that was really good, and I know both the Pensions Authority here and regulators across Europe have commented on that, how well that worked. Most important thing is contributions continued to get paid, contributions continued to get invested, and most importantly, pensions continued to be paid to people. So, you know, it all worked seamlessly, and that was good. I think, yeah, I would have some concerns about the, the lack of coverage for pension contributions. I think it displays a little bit of an attitude maybe that pension contributions aren't essential. In the UK, I know their decision to cover it was partially linked that these are people who've been auto-enrolled to a large extent, therefore it's important that those contributions continue to be paid for them. I think the lack of impact to some extent probably reflects that some of those areas that were worst hit by COVID initially, like retail and hospitality areas who were closed, tend to have very low pensions coverage anyway. So that's why you didn't see a fall off in contributions. I think the things like trustee meetings, those moving online, I think that's quite positive, and I think that's one of those things that will stay, and just our ability to receive and impart information. Gremlins aside, but there were gremlins of physical events as well. So not everything went seamlessly, but we've now got, I think, 170 people watching this. There's no way we probably would have had 170 people in an office or physically watching it. So that's been good. So I think that sort of thing will continue. Virtual meetings will continue. People will meet in person, but I think there will be a lot of virtual meetings. It just makes them more efficient for people. And then some of us will eventually get back into suits, but obviously some of us are doing that quicker than others.
Yeah, it's the lawyer in me, Jerry. But next slide, please, Sinead. Okay, so I suppose it's the main meat of the presentation is going to have a look at IORP2 and what schemes and employers and need to do in terms of getting ready for IORP2 now that it's here on our doorstep. What do we need to do? What are the relevant timelines? So I suppose the main thing is it came in 22nd of April 2021. So a bit of a surprise. It was a year and a half late in terms of coming in, and we didn't really expect it. As we know, applies to all schemes. I have a slide later on that sets out what schemes specifically it does and doesn't apply to, but the vast majority of schemes, I think there are exclusions such as RACs and PRSAs, but the vast majority of schemes come under its remit. I suppose one thing to note is that it doesn't apply whatsoever to public sector schemes, which is interesting. A major fly in the ointment and something that caused a good deal of consternation was there was no derogation to one member arrangements. So IORP 1 contained a derogation whereby its provisions, a lot of the provisions such as investment, didn't apply to one member arrangements. There's no such derogation in IORP 2, which led to a lot of these schemes having quickly to get up to speed with a change in how the schemes can invest and are managed going forward. From a legal perspective, there was significant changes to the Pensions Act. A few of those have caused issues. I'll discuss those a little bit more detail later on. Next slide, please, Sinead. And this slide, I mean, this is one that I think I've pulled out for the last 3 or 4 years, just in the lead up what to IORP 2 coming into play. What is the purpose of IORP 2? So you can see that ensuring good governance. I suppose the one that stands out to me is improved communication. The big consideration there is in relation to communication with deferred members who previously wouldn't have been caught in the net. So now communicating with deferred members is a responsibility going forward, and a difficult one, bearing in mind some of them may be difficult to trace and find. One that I think IORP 2 is falling short on, and we'll have to look at it again, is encouraging cross-border activity. I don't see a great appetite at the moment for cross-border schemes. Certainly with the clients I deal with, there's a lot of obstacles in relation to setting up those schemes, whether it's consents or to do with the bulk transfer regime. So the existing legislative framework is problematic in relation to a big European-wide aim, which is to have a fully portable pension system whereby individuals can work throughout the EU and their pension either transfers seamlessly or they contribute to a pot that's based in another member state. At the moment, I think there's a desire to get to that endpoint, but the legislative pieces of the puzzle aren't fitting together. Next slide, please, Sinead. Yeah, and so the main changes, a lot of people will be familiar with these. I mean, trustee boards, there's a new regime in relation to minimum qualification and experience. I've done various webinars and talks about what these are, so I won't go into them here. Key function holders, it's something that, from my experience, people are getting very familiar with now, because they're either being approached or approaching entities to work as key function holders in the sections flagged here: risk management, actuarial, and internal audit. I'll flag all the policies later on, but IORP 2 has led to a raft of policies being required for pension schemes. I think there's over 16 policies that need to be drafted. The first of which was the remuneration policy, which had to be in place by the end of last year. And my experience is most schemes have that in place now. It was one of the least problematic policies from a content point of view. I think it was very short and simple. The ones that I've certainly drafted were, and I'll flag issues that I see with the policies later on. Revised communications, I'll mention an issue in relation to that, which is sort of bugging the industry in relation to annual benefit statement, pension benefit statement. I'll flag that later. And as I indicated, possibly the group that's most affected by IORP 2 will be individuals or firms or trustees, pensioner trustees involved with one-member arrangements, because the playing field has totally changed for those schemes going forward. So big changes there. Next slide, please, Sinead. Yeah, so key function holders. This is a slide. I mean, it's interesting. I'm seeing a lot of movement in relation to key function holders, because schemes are really just getting up to speed with who can act for key function holders. You can see that the internal audit function holder has to be standalone function. And there's a lot of talk between trustees and employers whether or not key function holders can be shared in some way to reduce the cost. But schemes are definitely out there and looking to see who can act as a key function holder. There's a lot of interest in the pensions industry in terms of acting in that role. So those entities are coming to us and asking, what do we need to do to actually fulfill this role? Jerry, are you seeing a lot of action on the ground in entities and schemes looking into the whole concept of key function holders and the appointments?
Yeah, I think it's one of those the main issues people are looking at the moment, and I guess it's kind of starting to look at, you know, if you're large enough, is there somebody within the employer who can act in the role? You know, if there's an internal audit function within the sponsoring employer, can that work? Otherwise, you know, is there someone within some of your existing advisors, or else do you go to the market and look to see what's out there? And you know, obviously, you know, my understanding is costs can differ quite significantly as well. And I think one of the issues, it's not always clear with the roles what's actually expected. So I think that's one of the first things people really need to do is, you know, what do they want from the internal audit function? What do they want from the risk management function? Making sure that fits with the requirements, but then also using that as the basis to hire somebody, because you're not going to hire somebody or get a decent price unless you're clear on what you want them to do.
Yeah. Thanks, Jerry. Next slide, please, Sinead. Okay, and this is a slide I referred to earlier. I mean, it's a useful slide for people just to see what schemes that IORP 2 directions apply to. You can see DB, DC, one member. I suppose the main point is that the regulations don't apply to public sector schemes, and that was an interesting point, Jerry, wasn't it? That the IORP 2 regulations didn't affect those schemes?
Yeah, I mean, it is in the directive, and it was in the first directive, that they're not applicable to unfunded pay-as-you-go arrangements. And you know, that makes sense for some of the provisions, particularly around, you know, investment and stuff that just isn't relevant. But I do think there are arguments, and maybe it's not so much around the directive, but certainly the code of conduct, that a lot of the things that, you know, if you believe it's important that every member gets an annual pension benefit statement, it's kind of hard to see why that's important for people in private sector schemes and not for public sector schemes. So I would think at some stage that the Pension Authority may look at, you know, a similar code of conduct for public sector schemes.
Yeah, it certainly would make sense. Next slide, please. And following on from the regulations itself, the authority launched a code of practice, which was designed to assist in essentially the interpretation of the regulations. So the aim of the code was to provide trustees with assistance in becoming IORP 2 compliant. So the code sets out various policies and procedures. And in the next slide, please, Sinead, I think I'll go into a little bit more detail here. So there's minimum expectations for each scheme. I suppose if I'm being critical of the code of practice, it was seen by many practitioners in the pensions industry as being overly prescriptive and not really having any dilution. When you look at the size of schemes, there was hope that smaller schemes may have less of an impact of the regs on them. That's not the case. It was seen, they're very much a broad brush code of practice. Next slide, please, Shane. And as I said, there's a creation and a range of new policies concerning most of the areas in the regulations. So there has to be various contracts in place. You can see a contract in place with the investment manager, the scheme administrator, and any outsourcing also has to have a contract in place. So it goes back to my earlier comment that many saw this as overly prescriptive. So whereas IORP 2 set out a vast array of responsibilities for trustees, the code of practice, I think it's fair to say, put another layer of responsibilities onto trustees in relation to policies, procedures, contracts, reviews that need to be carried out. Next slide, please, Sinead. So I suppose if we're looking at the code and regulations and timelines, we can see various different dates of importance. So 22nd of April 2021, that was when the new investment rules came into effect. So there was a big rush from one member arrangements to look at how their new schemes going forward would be impacted by these, and to quickly look at their investment model and how they could actually work that for new schemes. Minimum of 2 compliant trustees, 31 December 2021. That generally was not problematic for most of the larger schemes. Some of the smaller schemes, it was slightly difficult, and they had to look at either appointing an individual that met the necessary qualifications and experience, or look at a professional trustee. Annual compliance statement, that was the last deadline that really came up. That was the end of January 2022. By and large, I think there wasn't much consternation or hassle about that, because most people knew actually what had to go in the annual compliance statement, and it wasn't a difficult document to put together. Pension benefit statement. Now, this is a totally different kettle of fish. What happened here is essentially IORP 2 brought in a requirement for a pension benefit statement. And the Pensions Act previously had language in it for an annual benefit statement that we'll all be familiar with. So the annual benefit statement language remained in the Act, and the pension benefit statement language was placed on top. So at the moment, there's confusion from schemes providers, life offices too, in relation to whether or not you need to actually provide 2 statements, which would seem to be a total waste of time and resources. Bearing in mind the content of both is by and large very similar. Now, I do know that the Pensions Authority is looking at this. There's hope that there will be clarity on this before the deadline of 31 December. But I think schemes are very anxious that they want clarity sooner rather than later. The main deadline, I suppose, is 1 January 2023. So that's the date of full compliance. So all the sites that I've mentioned previously, excuse me, all those requirements need to be in place by 1 January 2023. So all the policies, all the procedures, key function holders, there's a lot to do and a very short timeline, because before you know it, we'll be right on top of that deadline, and there's a bundle of work to be done. But Jerry, do you see any problems? Well, obviously the pension benefit statements in terms of the timeline is one that the industry really wants to get sorted.
Yeah, we met with the Pensions Charity a couple of weeks ago, and we raised this issue. I know they are discussing with the Society of Actuaries around the basis, because one of the things that's different on the pensions benefit statement is you need to, as well as having a projection, you need to have a kind of not quite a worst case scenario, but an unfavorable scenario. And I know they're looking at discussing whether you also then have a favorable scenario, so you've kind of got a good, bad, and medium in terms of the projections. But it is important that that is sorted out very quickly, because then you have to have administrators need to amend their systems, put that in place. And it's all going to be really difficult to get all that done by and have the statements issued by the end of this year, which is the requirement. So I think that's a bit of a concern. Touching on the code in general, I think, there was a draft code issued last summer. I think the final code was probably moved on from the draft code a little bit. We and many others have responded to the consultation around the draft code. But I think probably the most disappointing thing for people really was the lack of proportionality. I mean, the directive itself is littered with references to implementation being proportionate in nature, the size, scale of the scheme, and much of that was put in to actually allow for our schemes, which tend to be much smaller than many European counterparts. So I think that lack of proportionality, combined with the decision not to take up the derogation for smaller schemes. So everything now applies to smaller schemes. It doesn't matter whether you've 1 member, 2 members, or 10,000 members, you're expected to be doing the same stuff. So that is a bit of a disappointment. But I guess it does tie in with the desire to have more consolidation and effectively get rid of smaller schemes, because I think the reality for many smaller schemes is just not going to be feasible for them to continue. It's not going to be feasible to pay the costs of complying with IORP2.
Yeah. And on that point, Sinead, it's probably a good time to have a look at the poll responses just at this break point, essentially. Okay. Is their scheme organisation on track for full compliance with IORP2 by 1 January 2023? So 3/4 yes, a quarter no. So hopefully the no element will, excuse me, will improve as the year goes on. But that does speak to what I'm experiencing, because there's still a good amount of confusion with certain elements of the requirements. I think key function holders is causing people a lot of head scratching in the pension industry. Is your organisation considering moving its pension provision to a master trust? 4753. So that's surprising, I suppose, because as I'll allude to in the second piece of my presentation, I'm seeing a lot of movement in terms of master trust. So that's an interesting statistic from my point of view. And Jerry, how do you interpret the poll results? Are they what you're seeing?
Yeah, again, kind of similar view. It's good that so many people are on track, but 25% is still a significant proportion. Now, it may mean that those 25% have already decided they will be moving to master trust. So they're not really aiming to be compliant. Again, on a master trust, there certainly seems to be a significant amount of interest in that. And I think even among larger schemes, larger employers than people would have initially thought. Now, I think some of the larger employers may take a little bit more time. They might be able to cushion the cost of complying with IORP2 and get a sense of how the market develops in master trust and see how that goes, rather than just that their aim is to get there as quickly as possible because they don't want to incur any costs. But certainly, I think there does seem to be a very strong movement towards master trust.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jerry. Okay, Sinead, we'll move on to the next slide, please. Okay, and this really feeds into the scheme's readiness. If you look at the code and regulations, here's a list of some policies that need to be put in place and how often they need to be reviewed, because it's not just putting the policy in place, which is painful. It's having to review it and keep it up to date. So you can see the remuneration policy that scheme should have been in place since last December. It needs to be reviewed every 3 years. And that review period kind of flows through with the majority of policies. Some need to be reviewed annually, but the majority need to be reviewed every 3 years. But you can see from this slide, and I'm sure some people are looking at this and going, I wasn't aware we needed a policy, but this is only a short list. There are more policies than this are actually required, but these are the key ones that need to be reviewed. You can even see the trustee annual policy needs to be reviewed annually. So procedures need to be put in place in schemes whereby these policies can be reviewed on those bases. Next slide, please, Sinead. Okay, and you can see once again the procedural requirements. So if you'll even look at the second bullet here, appointment of key function holders, service providers. So this has to be looked at once every 3 years. And I'd say the first appointment will probably be the most tricky. Schemes are still getting their head around who can act, what they need to do, how much will cost. But schemes still need to put in place procedures whereby all of these elements, such as investment governance every 3 years, trustee meetings every 3 years, it's going to result in a large framework having to be put in place for schemes, and someone's going to have to take responsibility for that in the scheme, whether it's the trustee group or in larger schemes, if there's a secretary to the trustee board, it could certainly assist in that. But there's a hell of a lot to do there. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the problems that I'm seeing in terms of the regulations? So the first problem that I think has arisen is the annual benefit statement, pension benefit statement that I've highlighted before. I think that needs resolution. As I flagged, IORP 2, one of the prime aims was to encourage cross-border pensions throughout Europe. I don't think it's really working. I'm encountering various issues in terms of whether transfers are possible, or whether so the bulk transfer regime or the actual legislation itself results in various consent issues, which from a practical perspective make cross-border pensions very difficult to actually progress. Pension adjustment orders. Now, this is really an issue with master trusts, but it's something we're seeing whereby if a transfer is made to a master trust, that the pension adjustment order can tag along, because the pensions adjustment order is made scheme specific. So if you look at a pension adjustment order, it has the scheme details and the scheme number on it. So that won't track across when a transfer is made to a master trust. The only fix for that, I would say, is, well, twofold. One, for the individual to go back to court and incur costly family law costs to actually get the order amended to include the new scheme details, or a legislative fix, which is probably the wisest option. Now, I know there's various committees that are raising this. The IAPF is flagging it. I think the Law Society Pensions Committee also raised it, and the Association of Pension Lawyers in Ireland flagged this. So hopefully now the issue has been raised, there will be some sort of resolution. Policies, from my perspective, what I'm seeing in terms of head scratching in the policies is how much do we include? Because there's no precedent documentation out here for any of the policies. So they can be as long as short as you need. I mean, my advice to my clients is keep them as short as possible, because the more you put in, the more chance you have of tripping yourself up. So until there's further guidance on what needs to go in beyond the limited contents in relation that we're seeing in relation to the contents of the policy, my advice is to keep them shorter, and then we can always expand as things become clearer. But there's a lot of head scratching as to what exactly needs to go in all of these policies. Flagged it earlier, and just to reiterate, IORP 2 doesn't apply to public sector schemes, and as Jerry mentioned, some of the provisions seem totally and utterly to make sense to apply to schemes, whether they're public sector or private. Single member schemes, feeling aggrieved, certainly. They weren't under the umbrella of IORP 1, and suddenly IORP 2 comes along. And I think that, as Jerry flagged, there's no sense of proportionality, very broad brush stroke, and they feel that they've been caught up in requirements that probably will apply to larger schemes rather than smaller arrangements. High cost of compliance. This is an area Jerry might mention in a moment that I know the IAPF are looking at. But schemes are assessing how much will all of this cost. You can see all the policies I've mentioned, all of the procedures. They will all result in a high cost of compliance. It's very difficult to put a figure on it, but it is costly to do once. And then as the procedure set out, all of these policies need constant tinkering and updating. I flagged this a bit earlier on, IORP 2, enhanced communication responsibilities in relation to deferred members. How on earth will schemes track those deferred members? How far do they have to go? Is a case of putting an ad on the back of the Irish Times to track a deferred member using a tracking agency for a smaller benefit. There's a lot of questions out there in relation to how far schemes need to go to track deferred members to keep them in the communication loop. And there's various investment issues I don't intend to speak to today because they're somewhat complicated. But there are questions over definitions and investments, such as the one I flagged here, regulated markets, that I think need to be resolved in time. But Jerry, are you seeing any more IORP 2 potential issues or issues out there? I know you discussed with me previously that IAPF is looking at the cost of compliance with IORP 2 as well.
Yeah, so there are a few things. So just to touch on some of them, on the cost issue, we've got our spring conference coming up in 2 weeks' time. So one of the pieces of work we're doing ahead of that is to try and get a kind of sense of what the costs of compliance are. I think you're right in saying it's not going to be a single number for a single scheme, but more a sort of range of what the costs are and how they break down. And we think that just might be helpful for people who are, yet to make a decision about whether they're going to try and comply or whether it's going to go an alternative route. So we hope to have that. It'll be a piece we cover at the conference. On some of the other issues, I think just at a very general level, I think one of the issues is, as well as the cost, the whole timescale. And it's alluded to in one of the questions that's come through already in terms of the need to get ahead of this. So, rather than waiting to the end of the year and find, it's hard to get the advice you need, or it's hard to get put everything in place, that if you are going to comply, then it's important to get ahead of that. And even, if people do decide ultimately that they want to go to an alternative route, then it takes time to convert to a master trust. So, if that's the route you want to choose, or whether you go to PRSAs or whatever you want to do. So you need to make sure that, by the end of the year, you're expected to be fully compliant with IORP 2. But if you're decided to go to master trust, but you're not there yet, then, while I think to one extent the Pensions Authority will probably be practical around that, I think you have to show that you really are in the process. They're not going to be coming back to you every year and you just say, we're moving to master trust, but we haven't done anything yet. So I do think that timescale and capacity to convert to master trust is something people should keep in mind as well. And just, I know you said you wouldn't go into detail on regulation markets, but there are a couple of questions on it, so I'll just preempt those maybe.
I saw that there specifically for you, Jerry.
Yes, I saw that as well. So, the issue around regulation markets is as part of IORP 1 and 2, there is a requirement that the assets of the scheme are invested predominantly in regulated markets, and predominantly is meant to, is taken to mean more than 50%. The idea of that is that, you invest your assets in things that can be valued easily. And that is obviously one of the issues for one member arrangements where, their entire investment might be a property, and a property, as such is not a regulated market unless it's in a property fund, for example. IORP 2, the definition of regulated markets refers back to MiFID 2, and MiFID 2 is basically EU domiciled funds. There is some confusion around whether you're actually looking at where the fund is domiciled or where the individual investments within the fund reside. So I understand the Pensions Authority are planning and issuing some clarification around that. It has come up, we've asked at European level, it's come up in some countries as being a potential issue. Less around the domicile, people didn't seem to have a concern about that, but more where funds might in the future want to invest a lot more in, say, infrastructure or private equity, private market that wouldn't fall into that regulation market piece. So yeah, there is a little bit of confusion about that. We are trying to sort it out. We are talking to the authority about it. So we do hope to get some clarification on that.
Yeah, thanks a million, Jerry. And next slide, please, Sinead. Okay, so just a general piece on master trust. Now this isn't going to be a ladybird guide on master trust. I've done that previously about what they are and various concerns. I'll mention one concern that I have in relation to master trusts during this presentation, but it's going to be very high level. So there's a growing number of master trusts in Ireland. It's definitely an area where, legally speaking, since IORP 2 came on board, I've seen massive interest in it. At the moment, Jerry can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's 8 master trusts in Ireland. And I think that's going to grow, not exponentially, because I think the market will only take so many, but you're going to have a hell of a lot more master trusts, I think, judging by the interest out there in them. Okay, the Pensions Authority had an engagement program on master trusts, and the main issues they identified were governance structures, lack of business continuity planning, and I suppose the main bugbear was conflicts of interest. So where there was, where basically all of the entities were attached to companies, so the corporate trustee, the investment manager, the founder, could all have been linked companies. So they had concern in relation to that, and there were some moves from various master trusts to assuage the Pensions Authority in this area, that there were no conflicts of interest in place. And they definitely will become far more widespread master trusts, as I flagged earlier, with IORP 2 and auto-enrollment also on the horizon. I think you're looking at a lot more people being aware of what a master trust is in the years to come. Whereas now a lot of individuals, I'd say a lot of employees, I think that's a major obstacle, would be skeptical in a way of a master trust, simply because they believe it's, this is from my experience in dealing with employee concerns, would be they're not aware of what the product is. They're not aware of what a master trust actually is. They see it in some ways skeptical that it's just the employer shipping off the pension obligations to a third party and not really caring. So there is a bit of work to do, from my experience, in terms of communicating the benefits and also the negative aspects of master trusts to employees, where there is a change process. Because Jerry alluded to it earlier, that a lot of schemes may be considering moving to master trusts. And if you do consider moving to master trust, you've got to consider the change early doors, because even legally, there's a lot to do in terms of making sure you're properly up to speed in terms of what's in the master trust documentation. The employee communication piece is very important. And then also, if you've got an existing scheme, you have to consider how long it will take to wind that scheme up, because it isn't a question of just doing it overnight. There's various timelines. Communication responsibilities, whether it's under the disclosure regs or if you're doing a bulk transfer. So there's a lot of issues to be considered when moving to master trust. Next slide, please, Sinead. Okay, now this is really what I've just spoken to. So why are people, entities, organizations, trustees looking at master trusts? Well, the increased governance costs associated with IORP 2 and the regulatory burden. You can see from the previous slides, there's a lot to do in IORP 2, and it will be costly. Economies of scale, I mean, that's the essence behind the master trust. Professional trusteeship, yes, there is a move towards professional trusteeship, not just in master trust, but I suppose against single trusts schemes as well. I know Brendan Kennedy has mentioned several times that he's not looking to make the role of trustees professional, per se, but he is looking for a more professional trustee. So I think we're moving towards that. Of course, master trust, bearing in mind the product that they are, there's access to in-house expertise for investments and clients. And auto-enrollment. I mean, auto-enrollment will drive an interest in master trusts in terms of organizations looking to comply quickly with the requirements. Auto-enrollment, I think 2022 was the date whereby it was looking to kick off. There is still a big push for it. I think we're going to see movements later on this year and certainly into next year on it. because there is still an appetite throughout the pandemic. It persisted, so I think it will push on, and we will see movements on master trust toward the end of this year, and more so into next year. Next slide, please, Sinead. The Pensions Authority had a code of practice on master trust. I've included this I think it's a useful reference, especially for organizations, I suppose, that are thinking about maybe setting up a master trust more so than an employer. You can see there's various requirements in relation to the trustee of a master trust, capitalization requirements, the fact that it has to be a DAC. There's various requirements in terms of conflicts, minimum sets of standards. So we won't go through this whole slide now, but I think it is a reference point and it's interesting for employers and trustees alike in terms of a master trust provider and what it needs to comply with. Next slide, please. Okay, so the road ahead. What are we going to see? Looking into the crystal ball, as it were, what are we looking at? So certainly increased scheme consolidation. Jerry spoke to this earlier, that there is a drive to reduce the number of pension schemes in Ireland. Irrespective that I don't quite agree with the statistic that's constantly bandied about, because in Ireland we classify one-member arrangements as pension schemes, whereas other countries such as the UK don't do that. So this kind of quote that's lazily repeated, that we have more pension schemes than the rest of Europe combined, is somewhat irks me to a certain degree, to be quite honest. But we are going to see increased scheme consolidation going forward to reduce the number of schemes, and that's going to happen through master trusts. And also, I think I mentioned DB schemes later on, so I won't speak to that. But I think DB schemes, you'll see a slight reduction in them, but the schemes that are there, I don't think there's any rush to wind them up. Increased costs, certainly. You can see there's going to be increased costs associated with pensions driven by IORP 2. And that will be slightly problematic for schemes to deal with. They'll have to make a decision whether or not they have the financial resources or the will to meet those increased costs. This isn't a typo. The next bullet point that does say IORP 3, and I'll ask Jerry to speak to this in a moment, but there is talk in Europe about IORP 3. It's several years away, and God knows what it will entail, but I'll ask Jerry to speak to that in a moment. But it's out there. DB schemes, and what are we seeing in relation to DB schemes? It's been fairly quiet in relation to DB schemes and legislation. There hasn't been much in the region of winding up. I think, as I spoke to earlier, there wasn't massive funding issues for DB schemes as a result of the pandemic, thankfully. So it's largely a case of steady as you go. We're still seeing the standard work that we do for DB schemes, such as enhanced transfer value exercises and various kind of risk reduction exercises being in place. A lot of the schemes are already either close to new members or close to future accrual. So very little movement in that respect. As I spoke to, we're looking at, I see one of the questions that was being submitted is in relation to professionalism of trusteeship. You can see IORP 2 has driven a kind of stake through the heart of individuals being trustees. The way I see it, I don't think with all the requirements, the policies, the procedures to adhere to, you're seeing the day of people on the shop floor acting as trustees coming to a slow end, probably. Auto enrollment, I spoke to this, prepare for some more action on that towards the end of this year and next year. I think it's going to be pretty much as discussed. I mean, there have been various models banded about whether it's going to be similar to SSIA years ago, but I think it's going to be some sort of DC-based scheme with low enough contribution rates at the start ramping up. So similar enough to the UK. The pensions gender gap, I mean, that's a big point, and probably the biggest effect the pandemic had was, as Jerry spoke to, that the people who did lose their job, even temporarily, were in industries that traditionally didn't have great pensions exposure, so pubs, restaurants, etc. And this, together with the pensions gender gap, is something that I think needs to be looked at, and ways to address the pensions gender gap, whether that's providing pension contributions during periods of maternity leave, or probably just looking at the gender salary gap to really address it as well. But there's a whole remit, and I know as part of my work with the Pensions Council that advises the Minister, this is something that we have been looking on, and we've been submitting reports to the Minister in relation to the pensions gender gap. One thing I'd love to see is something to do with increased cross-border activity, because IORP2, I think, has failed to really stimulate that area and prompt any growth in terms of increased cross-border schemes. It's something that I think we are going to have to get on board very quickly. When you look at people's working lives and where they work around Europe and whatnot, I think this is something that we'll really need to look at and fix as quickly as possible. So Jerry, I know I mentioned IORP3 there, but Europe, obviously you're familiar through your work with Pensions Europe. What are you seeing? What do you view as the important pensions topics for the next few years?
Yeah, I think just on IORP3, just to maybe calm people down a bit, there is no prospect of an IORP3 anytime soon. I mean, the whole process around implementation of the directive is the Commission initially expects countries to notify them when they have transposed it. Obviously, we were the last to do that by some way, but other countries were late as well. So the Commission hasn't even finished the process of verifying the transposition procedures to make sure, because one thing telling the Commission you've transposed it, but they actually go and check that you have done it and you have done it properly in law. So that process is still ongoing. IORP2 does have a provision built in where it will be reviewed to ensure it's doing what it set out to do, that it's achieving that. That process hasn't kicked off yet. It's expected that will kick off at some stage this year, but there's no real prospect of any work starting on a new directive within the lifetime of this Parliament. So, we are talking about years away before we see anything. It's not necessarily a bad thing having a new directive. I mean, if it is, as it's intended to do, is kind of iron out any of the problems that might have emerged from the existing one. Just at a more general level, I think the issues I might add to that would be the state pension age. That's still a running issue. Government are expected to make a decision on that by the end of March, so we'll see what that is. Obviously, politically, it's incredibly sensitive, and it's a difficult one for them. But at the same time, I think there is an acknowledgement of, with the sort of demographic profile for the future, that something needs to be done around that. And then a very practical one for schemes as well, which I think not enough people are probably aware of. The next round of EOPA stress tests that schemes are meant to be doing takes place this year. In the past, it's pretty much been on a voluntary arrangement in Ireland because the Pensions Authority didn't have the powers to compel schemes to do it. The directive was meant to sort that out. I'm not sure whether it has or not, but there is a likelihood that the largest 100 schemes in the country will be required to do stress tests. Probably May, June is the timeline. There's a set timeline. So again, when we met the Pensions Authority recently, we did stress the need to, make schemes aware of that. And even identify the schemes that if schemes are going to have to do stress tests, they need to know that. They need to put the process around and that comes at additional cost as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a million, Jerry. I'm getting a wave to move to Q&A because I know we're at that point. We've got a mountain of questions here.
So do quick fire.
Most of them are addressed to you, Jerry, though.
Yeah.
So I'll work through as many as we possibly can. Okay, following the introduction of IORP2, is there a notable increase in the number of schemes taking on professional trustees? Well, I suppose if you look, master trusts, okay, the trustee has to be professional. It's a DAC. And then my experience is a lot of schemes, even prior to IORP2, were looking at either taking on a professional trustee in conjunction with the remaining trustees simply because the amount of regulation was so high. So certainly the answer to that is yes. For the last 2 years, I think I've seen an increase in schemes taking on a professional trustee. Jerry, do you have any input?
Yeah, no, and I think if you look at the requirement where, you know, a trustee board, and if you've got that mix of employer and employee nominated trustees, at least one of those is going to have either the LIA or the IIPM trustee qualification. So unless one of those people has gone off and done that, they're going to have to get somebody in who's got that qualification. So yes, I think is the answer. You will see more professional trustees. Maybe that they want to continue that arrangement, they just get an individual in to sit on the board, or maybe they just move to a sole professional trustee, which is probably going to happen a lot more as well.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think it's practical possible for the industry to be fully IORP compliant before the end of 2022? Well, not for every scheme, certainly. I mean, it's very scheme. Some schemes are much further down the journey than others, is my experience. So some schemes, there's not a drop of sweat on them at the moment when they think about IORP 2, whereas others are still thinking about what they have to do and putting in plans. I don't think every scheme is going to be compliant, and it'd be for a matter for schemes to address that with the authority, whether they flag it with the authority and say, for XYZ reason, we're finding it hard to do this, but our aim is to be compliant by X date and to deal with the authority then. But I don't think every scheme is going to be compliant by the end of 2022 at all. From my experience, obviously the schemes I'm dealing with, communicating, hopefully they will be, but I know a hell of a lot of schemes out there that are very poorly prepared at the moment, that probably need to do more work in it to get on target for the end of 2022 or early 2023. But Jerry, what do you think from your experience?
No, I'd agree with that. And I guess it is a case of deciding first what you're going to do. Are you going to try and get compliant, or are you going to go an alternative route? And that's probably the bigger decision schemes need to make. But I would take the point, if you are going for being compliant with IORP 2 and continuing on a standalone basis, then you need to get as much done as quickly as possible.
Okay. Given the amount of work involved, if schemes don't get ahead of the work now for compliance with the regulations, is there a risk around maybe difficulties securing timely professional help for full compliance deadline? There seems to be a risk.
Yes is the short answer.
Yes would be the answer to me. I mean, I know even anecdotally, just pensions lawyers, I've never seen us busier in terms of IORP 2 projects and then schemes turning to master trusts and master trust projects. So if pension lawyers, I think have never been busier on foot of IORP 2 and master trust. So I presume the same is for actuarial assistants, investment managers and whatnot, that it will be difficult securing assistance in the second half of the year, simply because there'll be so many of these projects ongoing with schemes trying to rush to get over the line at the end. So yeah, I think you're right, Jerry. Yes is the answer. Who does non-compliance fall on? Is it the responsibility of the existing trustee or the administrator of the scheme? The answer there is the trustee's head will be on the block. But the trustee usually is indemnified in the trust deed from the employer. So say if the trustee totally buries its head in the sand, doesn't do anything whatsoever on IORP 2, is fully non-compliant, if action is taken either by members or the authority against the trustee, now you'd argue that the trustee is breaching the terms of the indemnity, but I won't go into that. It could be the responsibility also of the employer under the indemnity to actually financially back up the actions or inactions of the trustee. So what I'd suggest is, yes, the trustee is number one, but the employer also needs to ensure that these actions are being taken. Okay. Can the trustees appoint an internal audit resource from the employer's internal audit team, as the KFH, on the understanding that they will be temporarily seconded to carry out 2 internal audits for the scheme trustees? I won't. I need to think about that in a bit more detail. I mean, the main issue that could create just looking at it off the top of my head would be a potential conflict here. But it could be possible, would be my initial view, but I'd need to come back. And if the individual can submit that question, feel free to send me an email and I'll have a better think about it. Okay, for a one member, an old one member scheme, when do they have to be fully compliant? Is the deadline January 2023, or do they have a bit of leeway? So yeah, the date for full compliance is 1 January 2023. So irrespective, one member or all schemes have to be fully compliant. Do they have a bit of leeway? Well, I think that's for individual schemes to address. I can certainly see a situation where if a scheme is in wind up, or if they're going into wind up and moving to a master trust, that if that was communicated to the authority, and I don't want to speak for the authority, that there would be some leeway in terms of being IORP compliant with a scheme that is going to be wound up in, let's say, February, March of 2023. But once again, I don't want to speak to the authority on that.
Yeah, sorry, Stephen, just on that, because I think the question is about the old one member arrangements, so the ones that were existing. So they do get a 5-year derogation. The ones that were existing at the time the regulations came out. So, but yeah, any new one member arrangements do have to be compliant sooner.
Okay, Grant. Sorry, I misread the one member old scheme. Yeah, okay. Okay, one final question, because I see we're going over date. Is a question for me on master trust. How do you reconcile the fact that the trustees who are responsibility for oversight of fees and charges, but the reality is that the fees and charges for each scheme joining a master trust are in fact negotiated between the provider and each employer? Yeah, I suppose that sits in the kind of conflict of interest point that I flagged earlier, because I mean, the trustees of a master trust are a DAC, and the responsibility for fees will be between discussing fees in relation to the master trust will come down to a discussion between the employer participating in the trust and the provider. So it's difficult to square the circle in reality on that, and it could potentially come down to a potential conflict issue. And I think I'll do one more quickly, because it's just popped up here. Can I list out the current master trust providers? It's like a Christmas cracker quiz. I can't really, but I know there's 8 is what I'll say. And they're I don't want to name people on the webinar today, but I know all the usual providers have master trusts in place. And I think, if I'm incorrect, there may be a list of them on the Pensions Authority's website, possibly. But I know there's 8 out there at the moment. Okay. So I don't want to hold any people up any longer. Apologies once again for pressing whatever button I did at the start, the nuclear button on my computer. My fault, no doubt, thoroughly. All that's left is for me to thank Jerry Moriarty for his time. Thank you for spending an hour of your morning with myself and Jerry, and hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you.